Hi, I'm Iman. I hope you're staying safe. This is Dr. Nerd. In this video, we're going to talk about action potentials. Simply put, action potentials are how neurons transport electrical signals. So here's a neuron, and this long part of the neuron is called the axon. This is where everything happens. At rest, the outside is positive and the inside is negative. They carry electrical potentials by movement of charges in and out. There are two important ions in this entire story, the sodium and potassium ions. Outside the neuron, there are a lot more sodium ions, and inside we have potassium ions. We also have negatively charged chloride ions, and together, these two give the inside an overall negative charge. We call this difference in charges across the membrane the electrical gradient or the electrochemical gradient. The resting membrane potential is much more negative compared to the outside. So when there's a strong stimulus, it causes a wave of depolarization to travel along the length of the axon. In this depolarization wave, all the charges slowly flip. So the inside slowly becomes more positive and the outside becomes more and more negative. At the end of the depolarization wave, there's another wave we call the repolarization wave. This basically returns things back to normal. It flips the charges back to being positive out and negative inside, but it doesn't bring them back to the resting potential that we started with. The repolarization wave overcorrects the magnitude of depolarization. So basically, it makes the membrane even more negative than it was at rest. This puts the cell in a refractory period or recovery period from which it needs to come out of to reach the resting potential again. And during the refractory period, no matter how strong a stimulus is, or no matter how many stimuli you give, there will not be an action potential. This is helpful because it keeps the action potentials going in one direction. So first, we're going to look at all of this on a graph. At rest, the membrane potential is negative. What we see here is that the membrane potential is at negative 70 millivolts. The threshold is the minimum potential that must be reached in order to fire an action potential. It's always higher than the resting membrane potential, and this is why we don't have action potentials firing constantly, even at rest. It's more positive than the resting membrane potential, so for there to be an action potential, it must reach negative 55 first, because negative 55 volts is higher than the resting membrane potential at negative 70. So let's say we have a stimulus over here. The first thing that's going to happen is depolarization. This was when the charges flipped along the membrane, making the inside more positive. And notice that here it goes up to about positive 40. Then after this, there's repolarization. This is when the charges slowly return back to normal and make the membrane less positive until slowly it's negative again. The end goal is to reach the resting membrane potential, but that doesn't happen right away. It overshoots, or in other words, hyperpolarizes the membrane, and this puts the membrane in a refractory period where no new stimulus can have an effect. The membrane has to go back to the resting potential for the next stimulus to cause an action potential. We want, at the end of the repolarization, to reach the same potential that we started at negative 70 millivolts. The whole point of repolarization is to start bringing the membrane potential back to its resting value, but it overcorrects, so it shoots down more than it needs to. It goes even lower than the resting membrane potential. So during this time, you can't have another action potential even if you constantly fire stimuli, because it needs to be at the normal resting value. This overcorrection is then rapidly fixed and the potential is brought back to normal. This is what happens when the stimulus is not strong enough to raise the membrane potential up to the threshold. All of these are failed initiations. There is no action potential. Now we're going to look at all of this in a little more detail. This entire thing is achieved by three important membrane components: the sodium channels, potassium channels, and the sodium-potassium pumps. They're easy to remember. It's just sodium, potassium, and sodium-potassium pumps. Everything starts with a sodium channel. So we begin from a state of rest. There's a large amount of sodium ions outside and potassium ions inside. The sodium channel first opens in response to the stimulus. This allows the sodium ions from the outside to move in along their concentration gradient. They move from an area of high concentration outside to an area of low concentration inside. This movement of sodium is what causes depolarization. This is the depolarization. Once they're inside, the membrane becomes much more positive now because both ions are positively charged and they're inside, and there are very few positively charged ions left outside. So the inside is relatively more positive. This is what closes the sodium channels. The next part of the story are the potassium channels. The inside positive environment was what closed the sodium channels, but this is what opens the potassium channels. The potassium ions move outside along their concentration gradient. They move from an area of high concentration again to an area of low concentration, but of potassium ions, of course. And as these positive ions start leaving, the inside slowly starts becoming less and less positive. This is repolarization. It becomes less and less positive till it eventually becomes negative, and the whole goal is to reach the same resting potential at negative 70 millivolts that we started with. One important thing to notice here is that more potassium ions are now outside than sodium ions inside. So relatively, the outside is more positive compared to the inside. This outside becoming more positive closes the potassium channels and starts the refractory period, because now the inside is relatively more negative than it was at rest. The reason for that is because we have too many potassium ions outside. It's not as well portrayed here because we only have, I think, 2 or 3 extra potassium ions, but generally there are a lot more potassium ions outside than there are sodium ions inside. So there are more positive charges out, less positive charges in. It makes the outside more positive and the inside relatively negative compared to that. Now, for a new signal to be sent, the sodium and potassium ions would have to move back to their original positions and bring the membrane potential back to the resting state. For that to happen, you need to have these charges move against their electrochemical gradients, and for that, energy is required. This is where the sodium-potassium pumps come in. These pumps use 1 molecule of ATP to move 3 sodium ions out and 4 potassium ions in. So first, 3 sodium ions move to their positions on the pump, and a molecule of ATP binds to the pump and provides it with energy. The pump uses this energy to change its orientation, and 3 sodium ions are released out and potassium ions are brought back in. This happens rapidly and uses a lot of energy to bring the potential back to the resting value at negative 70 millivolts. Now let's look at all of this again with the graph. When there's a stimulus, the sodium channels open and the sodium ions move in. The movement of sodium ions inside causes depolarization. It makes the membrane much more positive. It goes up to about positive 40. At the end of depolarization, the positive membrane potential closes the sodium channels and opens the potassium channels. The potassium ions move out, making the membrane potential less and less positive until it approaches the resting membrane potential. This is repolarization. Since more positive potassium ions leave, the membrane potential becomes even less positive than the resting potential. This puts the membrane in a refractory period. The membrane has now become hyperpolarized. For it to go back to the resting state, it needs to move the ions back to their original positions, and this requires energy. The sodium-potassium pumps then use ATP to rapidly bring it back to the resting state, and now it's ready for the next action potential. The cycle repeats countless times all throughout the day, every single time an action potential is sent anywhere in the body. And you achieve the resting state. And again, in the resting state, we have much more sodium ions out and potassium ions in. So in summary, first you have a stimulus. The stimulus will cause depolarization. Depolarization is always associated with sodium ions. So depolarization, remember, is linked to sodium ions moving in. Then after this, we have repolarization. Repolarization is always associated with potassium ions, and potassium ions move out. Then after this, we have hyperpolarization because too many potassium ions have moved out. And then this is fixed by the sodium-potassium pump, which uses energy in the form of ATP to bring back the sodium out and the potassium in, and bring the membrane potential back to the normal value at -72 millivolts. So that's it for this video. These are the resources I've used. I hope this helped and made the concept easier to understand. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.